Welcome, everyone, to Memorial Presbyterian Church. We welcome our partner, Flagler College, Lifelong Learning. I see several Flagler folks, and we're so delighted that you're here. It's a special partnership that we have. I forgot to introduce myself last week. Some of you know me, but I am Reverend Amy Lair Camp, and I'm also Hunter's wife, so that's great. And it's a special treat to have our head of staff, our pastor, back from a 3-month sabbatical. Tonight's his first night back. Where are you, Hunter? Hunter Camp. Right there, Hunter Camp. Welcome back. Welcome to our friends online. We have interfaith community friends. We have Westminster, St. Augustine friends. And we are so glad that you're here. We have memorial members as well. We know it's dangerous to brave the downtown waters on a rainy night, so we just are so glad that you're with us. So some of you may have missed last week, and I had a couple people say, I did miss last week, I want the handout. So raise your hand if you would like a handout. We have a few handouts from last week. So here in this back section, Ellen is bringing the keep your hands high, and Ellen is going to give the ones that need a handout on ordered loves. Really, really helpful handout. So just keep those hands high, and it was awesome, and it's going to be awesome tonight and awesome next week, so please come back. Yes, come on up, Justin.
We on here? Can everyone hear me? We're trying a different microphone situation today. So, all right. So let's get started. I want to begin by just doing a little bit of recap of what we did last time and connecting it with some things that we're going to talk about. So this class, A Life Well Lived, is a class that Justin and I teach at Flagler, and it's a semester-long investigation into the nature of a good life and how do we live a good life and what sort of things and practices and ideas are necessary to shape or help us live that good life. And so this is a class that we teach over a 15-week semester. And what we're doing here, this is sort of giving you a little preview or highlight of that class. And so, right, that's the idea. And so the way we started last week is the way we start the semester with our students. And we asked them to think about, well, what sorts of things do you need to live a good life? I mean, it seems pretty obvious that if you're going to live a good life that is both valuable from a sort of objective, God's eye perspective, and also one that is fulfilling to the person who's living that life, it seems like there are certain things that are going to be necessary or important. And so we began by asking you all to think, well, what are those things, right? And we gave you a list of possibilities. What are those things that you deem most important or most essential for living a good life? Now, I think both Justin and I would agree, not just any life counts as a good life, a life well lived. Nevertheless, there are a variety of ways to live a good life. So one of the sort of points or ideas of last week's activity is to get you thinking, given that there's a variety of ways to live a good life, what might be essential for me to live a good life and my vision of a good life? And we asked you by, reflecting on this list and sort of narrowing it down to think about the answer to that question. However, we also noted that once you've identified those things that are essential for a good life, and even if you have them in your life, that doesn't necessarily mean you're on your way to happiness and flourishing, right? And so the analogy we used was this. If you go to IKEA and you buy a new desk and you take it home and you open the box and you dump all the parts out on the desk, you've got all the things that you need to have a desk, but you don't yet have a desk, right? Because in order to get that desk, those parts need to be combined or ordered in the right way. And in a similar way, St. Augustine, our town's namesake, had this idea of ordered loves. And the thought was, or the rough thought was, that even if you've got everything that is essential for living a good life, if your loves are disordered, then that can still wreak havoc on your life and inhibit you from flourishing, right? So work and having a meaningful and fulfilling career can be an important and perhaps even essential element in living a good life. But if your work, even if it's good and valuable, causes you to trample other people, to ignore their concerns, right, then arguably you have disordered loves, because it seems like very arguable, very plausible, especially from a Christian perspective, that the needs and concerns of others, right, should take precedence, right, should be ordered higher than your concerns for, right, fulfilling your career. So Augustine had this idea of ordered loves, and one of the things we asked you to think about last week was, even if you've got all these essential things, are they ordered in the correct way? Is your behavior, the way you spend your time, the way you spend your mental energy, the way you spend your money, does that align with the values that you've set for yourself? So that was the challenge that we brought to you last week in thinking about ordered loves. What we're going to do tonight and then next week, and what we do in our class, is the rest of the semester is spent looking at ancient traditions of wisdom. We look at Judaism, we look at Christianity on the side of the religion, and then philosophically we look at the Stoics and Aristotle. And the idea is we want to interrogate these traditions to see what they can help us learn, both about the things that are essential for a good life, and also what are the kinds of practices that we might engage in to help us order our loves better and to help us get those things and keep those things in our lives that are really important for living a good life. So here's what we're going to do with you all tonight and tomorrow. Tonight we are going to look at Judaism, and we're going to look at a particular practice in Judaism, the idea of Sabbath. And we're going to talk about how the practice of Sabbath might help us keep the important things important and help us to keep our loves ordered and contribute to living a good life. Then next week what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at Aristotle, the Greek philosopher Aristotle. And Aristotle had a lot to say about friendship, and he thought friendship was a really important and central thing to living a good life. And if our discussion from last week was any indication, most of you think that friendship and family relationships are some of the most important things to living a good life. So next week we're going to take a look at Aristotle and to see what he had about friendship and how his ideas of friendship might help us better understand what friendship is and how it plays a role in us living a good life. Right? So that's the plan, and that's how it connects up with what we were talking about last week, talking about ordered loves. So today we're going to look at this Jewish practice and idea of Sabbath. And so sort of to get us started, I want to just give a very brief overview of Judaism, and then Justin's going to talk to us about the practice of Sabbath. So in giving this brief overview, I'm sort of painfully aware that there's no way I can do justice to Judaism and all of its various manifestations over the centuries and millennia, right? That's just not something that can be done in 5 minutes. But we at least want to get some central ideas and themes that sort of reemerge in Judaism on the table, right, to help us understand how the idea and the practice of Sabbath might fit into this tradition and how we might take those ideas and apply them to our own lives, even if we ourselves aren't Jewish. So, as I'm sure most of you probably know, Judaism is an ancient, one of the most ancient monotheistic religions, right? So the Jews, unlike many of their ancient neighbors, believed in one God, right? And not just one supreme God, but one and only God, right? And this was a major distinguishing feature of their religion. But I think one of the things that makes Judaism unique is there's a central idea of covenant. And that idea of covenant plays a role in shaping the identity both of Judaism as a religion and the Jewish people as a unique people. And so one of the big themes that we get in Judaism is this idea that the Jews are God's chosen people, and He is their God. And this has been sort of enshrined in covenants. And when we make a covenant with one another, right, there's a sense in which we belong to one another. So those who are in covenant with one another sort of have these responsibilities and connections to one another. And so in Jewish practice, the Jews have come into covenant with God. And one, I think, really important thing to emphasize is in this covenant, the people weren't invited into this covenant because of something they did, right? This was the gracious outreach of God that did this. So God chose the Jewish people not because of what they could do, right? But because of his love and his grace and their generosity and his generosity towards them. And this links up with another important idea in Judaism, which is the idea of the law. Many of you might know that a central part of the Jewish scriptures comes in the biblical books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, and also in parts in the book of Numbers and 2, where we have the Levitical law, and law is really central. But there's sometimes when you hear overviews of Judaism, you get this, we would argue, mistaken idea that in order to be God's people, the Jewish people have to follow the law. But as we read the Jewish text, that's not actually how it goes. Rather, the purpose of the law isn't so that the Jewish people can enter into covenant with God. The purpose of God, or the purpose of the law, is to provide boundaries that enable the covenant relationship between God and his people to flourish. So an analogy we often use with our students is this. Think about your favorite game, whatever it is. Maybe it's Monopoly or chess. Maybe it's lacrosse or soccer, right? Maybe it's, as my 7-year-old would say, dodgeball, right? But whatever your game is. Now think of that game devoid of any of the rules. The game ceased to exist, right? As soon as you take away the rules of the game, you don't have the game. If you can just pick up the ball in soccer and run with it and throw it in the goal, right, then it ceases to become soccer. So the law in Judaism provides this shape for this covenant relationship. And in the Jewish scriptures, we get not only the law laid out in text form, but the Jewish scriptures have been constructed in such a way to talk about how this law gets played out in practice, both at a communal level with the Hebrew people, but also at a personal level. So if we look at the Jewish scriptures, we see that they're broken up into roughly 3 groups. So I think on the handout, you have these groups listed. In the first group, we get the Torah. And the way we like to talk about the Torah with our students is to think about it as an origin story. So the Torah represents roughly the first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures, and it provides us an origin story. So if any of you have watched comic book movies, right, Marvel movies, or you've ever read comics, a central sort of trope or idea is we have the origin story. How did Batman become Batman? Right? How did Spider-Man become Spider-Man, right? And what are sort of the defining features of these characters? Well, the Torah provides us something similar for Judaism and for the Jewish people. How did we become the people of God, right? And how is this relationship constructed, right? So we get the creation narrative, we get the Exodus from Egypt narrative as sort of these origin stories. We get the covenant that God made with Abraham and that he reiterated throughout the generations. And then, right, in the Exodus, we get the law, right, as laid, the Mosaic law as laid down, right, as a way of shaping and defining the boundaries of this relationship and how this relationship can flourish, right? So we see the Torah as sort of this origin story, not just of a system of rules, but as a people, a covenant people, God's people, in which, right, they are his people and he is their God. Then in the second group, or the second sort of component of the Hebrew scriptures, we get the Nevi'im, the prophets. And I think a helpful way to think about the prophets is they were the whistleblowers of the community. They were the ones with the pickets saying, this isn't right. So when the Jewish people would stray, when they would engage in injustice, the prophets would come along and say, this isn't right, right? We are the whistleblowers. We are the ones that pointing out that you who are in authority, right, are, even if you're abiding by the letter of the law, you're not abiding by the spirit of the law. So for For instance, one thing you often get in the prophets is the prophets calling out the wealthy or those in power for using their wealth and using their power to trample on the weak, right, and the penniless and the poor and the sick, right, and used to ignore or, right, perhaps even do justice to them. Right? So in this sense, they are the whistleblowers, and they're trying to call the people of Israel back in, right, to this covenant relationship that they have with God. And then finally, we get the Ketuvim, the writings. So these are the books of the Bible that you might think of, like the Psalms and the Proverbs and the Song of Songs, right? And one helpful way to think about these are, these are books that picture the human experience as it connects with the covenant of God and sort of where the rubber meets the road in personal life. So if you've ever experienced tragedy, if you've lost a child, if your career has been torpedoed, right? If you've suffered from ill health that has significantly impacted your ability to flourish and to enjoy life, you can go to the book of Job and there, right, find someone who had a similar experience and how they related that experience to their relationship with God and to those around them. If you've ever been so angry at the injustice in the world, whether it's the injustice sort of in the world at large or maybe an injustice that's done to you, you can go to the Psalms. And in the Psalms, we get violent language. Sometimes the psalmist says, God, I wish you would bash my enemies to death against the rocks, right? This isn't prim and proper religious language. This is real emotions and real experiences, but they are expressed, right, in the context of this covenant relationship with God and his people, right? Right? If you've ever enjoyed the joys, right, of sexual intimacy, right, and the benefits that that can bring, you can go to the Song of Songs and read about romantic love and read about how that experience, right, can shape a life in the context of this covenant relationship with God. So in the central scriptures of Judaism, we see this theme of covenant, and we see it not only sort of at the level of principle, but these scriptures also bring it down to the level of practice. As they bring it down to the level of practice and human experience, we get some suggestions, some ideas, and in particular, some practices that help shape the Jewish experience and arguably, Justin and I would say, contribute to a life well lived. And so what we're going to do tonight is sort of interrogate and examine one of those practices and challenge you to think about that practice, and if you don't already incorporate it into your life, to think about how you can incorporate it into your life, what benefits it might hold for you. And even if you already do incorporate it into your life, to think about how you can do it better. We just actually taught this, a similar session to our students this week. And one of the things we have them do is take a mini 20-minute Sabbath out on the campus where they're not allowed to be on their phones or talking to their friends or one another. And one thing I asked myself when we were doing this is, say, we've been doing this for several years. I've known about this idea of Sabbath. Am I doing better at practicing Sabbath than I was last year at this time when we were talking about it? So even if the idea of Sabbath is something that's familiar to you and that you already incorporate, odds are, right, you can think about how you can better incorporate it and how you can sort of better understand the practice and how it contributes to a life well lived. So Justin's going to talk to us about the practice of Sabbath.
Thank you. I feel like every time we talk about this practice, I have to confess that a few years ago when we first took students out onto the lawn and had them do this beautiful, 20-minute, wildly disruptive for many of them practice, we had everyone hold up their phones, right? So if you could just hold up your phone with me, right? And I had them turn their phones off. And then the humiliating thing was I didn't actually know how to turn my phone off in the moment. And so I'm like, oh, shoot, how do I do this? And I'm like, somebody had to come up and be like, here's how you turn it off. I'm like, this is so revealing, right? That I didn't know how to turn my own phone off as I was telling you to do it, and that was really embarrassing. But it also made a point. And so I feel this sense of like, I need to share that every time we talk about this because I'm very much a novice with you, with them as we do this. And so it was beautiful. Yesterday we had sunshiny clouds, beautiful day. It was gorgeous. And if you had walked by campus in the afternoon, you saw 50, 60 students spread out all over campus. In fact, the president of the college walked by and looked very concerned And I saw him later, and he goes, I didn't know if we were about to have a protest or something. I didn't know what was going on. And I thought, well, it's quite the opposite. Core to this understanding of covenant, core to the sort of the center of Judaism, is a strong and clear sense of belonging and identity. Okay? Identity. Who am I? That question is supplied. Who has my family been? Who will we be? This is who we are, right? The covenant people of God. I will be your God and you will be my people, is the sort of constant refrain that comes to us many times. And I would argue that we, people living today, we are constantly being formed or, at the same time, being malformed in many different ways. And so this question of identity is absolutely a relevant question for us. And across the street, it's wildly relevant for our 19-year-olds and our 20-year-olds who are, for the first time have maybe left home and are asking these sort of questions, right? But the truth is, and I try to tell them this, Capes and I would argue probably all of you, we're continuing to wrestle with that question ourselves. Who am I? What kind of life do I want to live, right? And where do I draw the answers to these questions? Where are these answers that I'm coming up with, where are they being shaped, okay? And so if we are to understand ourselves as people who are being constantly formed for the good or ill, right? There's a malformation taking place as well as a formation. We have to ask ourselves, how are we being formed? Where are these things coming from, okay? And so I have this question that I want us to play with for a minute. What do you think supplies an answer to this question? Like, what makes you valuable? What makes you valuable? Can we just get some people to throw out some answers? What makes you valuable? Say it again. Valuable. Valuable. What makes you valuable? What makes you good? Yes. Family connections? Relationships? Sorry? Kindness? Y'all are answering some really beautiful answers, but in reality, in real life, where do a lot of our answers come from that we maybe don't always want to admit? What? Money? Wealth? Yeah? Things that we're buying? What else?
How about reputation?
Reputation, involvement in the community? Yeah? Appearance? Yeah? Jobs, careers? Joe? If you're fun or not? You're kind of fun. What else? One more time. Self-concept, is that what we said? How you see yourself, great. I would say that a lot of our students, and I think this is true for us as well, we are given a narrative that we can adopt as to what would be a successful life, right? It needs to look like a certain thing. I remember I grew up in Orlando. I grew up at First Presbyterian Orlando, big downtown Orlando church, and I thought that like what a good life meant was that I would drive a Volvo. I don't know why I associated it with a Volvo, but it was a Volvo, and I would have a cute wife, and I would have like 2 kids, and they would show up wearing like coats and ties, and they would be like clean all the time, and they would be so well-mannered, and we would have a good job. It'd be respectable. We'd make good money, but not too much, because that's flashy, but also not enough to ever feel a lack of money, because you don't want that. And there's a number of things like that that were just sort of given to me. I was being formed to see that as a good life, right? And there's some of those things are fine, but there's some real problems baked in to our understanding of what makes us valuable or what makes us good. In this class, we talk about this idea of being like one of the lens through which we understand our value. We call it different anthropologies, okay? And so the dominant force, I would argue, that is shaping our culture, our community, our lives, is an economic anthropology. In other words, your ability to participate in a free market economy, your purchasing power, right? Your net worth, the way in which you can buy or create a widget and sell the thing, right? That is going to directly equate to your value in the community. It's often not kindness or our self-understanding or the relationships that we have. How often do we hear those things being celebrated, or lifted up publicly? Instead, it's usually these sort of externalized markers that help us think, oh, I've arrived. right? I remember I was working on my PhD, and I thought it was going to change something. And the day that I finished, and I defended my PhD, I defended my dissertation, my son, who I think was like 8 or 9 at the time, he knew it was a big deal. And he comes up and he goes, "Dad, congratulations." He gives me a big old hug. "Can you take me and Judah to the beach?" Like that quick, right? He knew it mattered to him. He just wanted me to take him and his buddy to the beach. And I thought to myself, that's exactly as it should be, right? This is so much more important than this externalized thing that I had put too much stock in, right? A PhD, I mean, sure, it's a thing. It's worth doing, I guess. Maybe not, but it wasn't anywhere near more important than my relationship with my son and the life that we were going to have together. This idea of our identity being formed primarily through economics is really problematic. In other words, what if you don't get that job? Are you no longer lovable? What if what if you experience financial ruin? Are you no longer someone who is good? There's nothing beautiful about you, like you're dismissible in a way? And I think these are things that we have got to cultivate the skills or build the muscle to interrogate and say, okay, I have this house. What if I lost this house? Right? I have this car. What if I lost this car? Is anybody going to ever care about the car I'm driving? Do you remember the car you had 20 years ago? Probably not. Maybe some of you do. Maybe you had really cool cars. I don't know. I didn't have a very cool car 20 years ago. But I do remember it was a 1983 Volvo. And that thing, and maybe I'm just putting that together with the fact that I grew up thinking Volvos meant something, but anyways, whatever. The alternative to an economic anthropology, though, and this is supplied to us through this notion of identity and belonging in Judaism, would be a theological anthropology. In other words, there's a different starting point for where to draw an answer from. Okay? The economic anthropology starts with your ability to purchase, your ability to consume, your participating in this house of cards that we all hold up and say is our lives, right? A theological anthropology starts from a very different place. In fact, it starts in Genesis 1, like in the beginning there. Okay, so we have the creation of all the good things, the first 5 days in the creation narrative. And then we get to the 6th day and where humans are created, man and female created in God's image. And every other day, God looks over the things that are being created and says, this is good. This is good. Night, rest, new day comes. Day 6, though, looks out over humanity and says, this is good. In fact, this is very good, a fundamentally different kind of good, a different substantive sort of source of goodness. And the beauty of this is what had humanity, men and women, Adam and Eve, what had they done at this point to earn having been called very good? Nothing. Nothing. There was no opportunity even for them to try and spin their wheels to go and validate their existence or justify that they were lovable. There was no opportunity for this. They were created and then they were called very good. And do you remember what the first task given to humanity is? What is it? It's to rest. The very next day is to rest. Your first homework assignment, take a nap, right? Our students would love that. We should do that, actually. We're always tweaking this course to try and have it be provocative and fun, and maybe giving them naps as an assignment would be, that would be all right. So if the question is identity formation versus malformation, and we're interrogating an economic anthropology up against a theological anthropology, in other words, where do we draw our answer from? Okay, we draw our answer from God, and we're told that we are very good. And then the first task given is to rest. This is where we get this practice of Sabbath. And, when you start to look at Sabbath, there's a number of different ways that we talk about Sabbath. In fact, what I'd like to do right now is if you would get in groups of like 3 to 5, I want you to answer this question. What do you know of Sabbath? What have you heard of Sabbath? Or how did you grow up thinking about Sabbath? Let's just take a minute and go ahead and get in little groups, meet your neighbor, shake your hand. I promise they won't bite. Okay, let's take maybe 30 more seconds, which is not enough time, I know that. Okay. Would 2 or 3 people be willing to share what they sort of associate or what they understood of Sabbath? Oh, you're pointing? You just got pointed at. She pointed at you. Can you believe it? I'll repeat it in just a second, everybody. Okay, so the Sabbath was you can't do anything unless you're doing something for somebody else. And the sort of memorable experience was like, you know, Uncle What's-His-Face could go on the sailboat as long as he took somebody else on the sailboat. So it would have been good to be his friend. That worked out all right. Good, what else? Sabbath. Yes?
I grew up Jewish.
Yeah?
We observed the Sabbath every Saturday, Friday night, Sunday. It was always a family.
Yeah.
Friday night dinner, with cousins and uncles and aunts. Saturday was march off to synagogue to shul. It was.
I'll repeat it in just a second, don't worry.
We were supposed to walk to synagogue, but it was too far away, so we drove.
Ah, okay. So our brother here grew up Jewish, is Jewish, and talked about having a family meal, walking to synagogue, or maybe taking the car if it was a little too far, and really carving out time, right?
Carving out time, not doing any work.
No work.
You couldn't carry anything.
Yeah,
You had to.
that's excellent.
Everything was turned on prior to Friday night, so that you could have it available on Saturday.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, let's get one more. Yep. Changed. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. So if you couldn't hear that, what he said was it used to be this sort of cultural norm or communal norm that things would not be open. You wouldn't expect something of someone else on the Sabbath. And so you wouldn't expect a call or have a business be open and things like that. And then he noticed that shift over time that he felt was concerning to say now it's sort of an expectation. Like, what are you doing closed? In other words, why can't you get this to my house in 24 hours or less, right? How about one more? Yeah, blue laws. So growing up in Virginia, there were laws that prevented businesses from, blue laws that would prevent certain sales of different things like that. So it was even institutionalized, is what you're saying. Yeah, that's excellent. I grew up in a home that you would go to church on Sunday morning, and then we'd go home and you'd get to your chores. And I say I grew up in that home, it's actually the home that I struggle to not have be that way now. Like, it's a good time to get ready for the week is how it often feels. And our kids, they got wise on us, right? They learned about the Sabbath. So maybe this is a warning not to teach your kids this stuff, because they started saying, well, Dad, the Sabbath, can't do my chores. And I'm like, you should have done them yesterday. I don't know what to say, But they like to hold it over our head. But yeah, I think we have a number of different sort of sources of understanding about what the Sabbath is. One way to think about the Sabbath, Abraham Heschel calls it a sanctuary in time. carving out a sanctuary in time. And so a Jewish understanding of Sabbath would start at sundown on Friday, go to Saturday evening sundown. And you know what? Whether you were done with what you were working on Friday at sundown or not, the Sabbath started, right? Yeah, I like that you're here to give me a little affirmation along the way. If I do something stupid, don't say anything, just let it go. Another way to think about the Sabbath often is talked about as rest. And that's not necessarily a bad way to think about it, but it's not just go take a nap, right? It's a pause, it's an unplugging from, it's an intentional decision to push back from all the norms of life that in some ways are forming us, maybe in an okay way, but would also be the source of malformation, right? We're gonna pause and push back from those things in order to be reminded of our core identity, right? Who am I? I think about this idea of having this family dinner and it just being expected that you were there. That reminds the family that you're a part of the family, right? We invite students to my home for a meal. Has been a practice that we've done on and off over the years. And I'm always surprised at our students how different it feels for some of them to sit around a table and have a meal together. Yeah, for many of them, that's not a part of their life, right? There's this idea of like, well, who are you then when you don't know where to call home, who to call home, how to identify and understand your sense of identity when it's sort of in the wind, I guess. So Sabbath is a sanctuary carved out in time, would be one way to think about it. A pause or a surrender, an unplugging. But it's also a command, right? And we're commanded to keep it holy, right? To respect this. In other words, it's a big deal that we should wrestle with this notion of Sabbath and giving ourselves to that practice. One thing I want to comment on around rest, I think this is a really good impulse for us to consider rest part of what Sabbath looks like. But there's a little bit of a trap here, okay? And I think we can see this in the way in which rest, mindfulness, meditation, a number of these different sort of practices have been picked up and adopted by, essentially by the business world, right? And the idea there is that we're going to instrumentalize the practice for the sake of our economic gain. In other words, if you stop and meditate for 20 minutes in the middle of the day, you're going to be even more productive, right? If you get 8 hours of sleep, you can work even harder the other hours that you're awake and that you're working. And this is missing the boat. This is not a good idea. When we instrumentalize rest, when we instrumentalize the Sabbath, and it only has value because of what it will do for us the rest of the week, we have missed completely what the invitation or the command in Sabbath is, right? So if I'm resting just so that I can get to the next thing, I never rested in the first place. It was always a function of what was next. And so it's worth us interrogating, even when we allow ourselves to have a day off. If the day off is to catch up, get ready for the next day, did we have a day off? And I don't pretend to think this is easy, by the way. Like, let me just time out real quick. I have 6 children. That feels miserable at times. It's wonderful at times. We feel like we're on this constant, we are exhausted. We usually crash into the end of the day, and we have to wrestle with Sabbath. We have to wrestle with rest, these ideas. But it's just worth noting that when we say that there's value in prayer or meditation, or when there's value in a Sabbath because it helps us be even more productive, then we are a slave to productivity. We are not free in this sort of covenant relationship with God. Those are wildly different things, and it's really worth thinking about that. So, the idea of Sabbath is to unplug and to sort of get back to this sort of core base of identity formation again and again and again, every single week, right? In fact, you could consider it to be small little expressions of Sabbath every single day, multiple times a day. Or even further to say in every single moment, right? You can kind of play with these ideas and get as existential as you want. But the notion here is to be reminded and to have consistent reminders of who we are. Just as important, who we're not, right? I'm not a slave to my work, okay? I teach at Flagler College. Like, my self-worth cannot be rooted in whether or not I get promoted. Good God, right? I cannot place my self-worth and understanding of who I am in my net worth. How much of a disaster would that be? There are 3 things that I want us to talk about. Oh, Lord. We always run out of time. I get so annoyed. I start throwing markers around the classroom because I just want more time. There are 3 things I want us to consider. The sort of invitation of Sabbath in terms of how it might form us. These are some lies, okay? One lie is we are in control. And you see these on your handout here. The lie of being in control. The Sabbath comes on Friday night whether you're ready for it or not, right? Whether you have things that are in the back of your mind or not. The discipline is there to stop you in your tracks very much on purpose, okay? And so this notion of being in control is sort of a farce. For us, this is going to cut against this notion that I am in charge of my own life, right? That my life is mine, and that I'm going to do with it the things that I want. What if I'm in the middle of a project or a busy season, right? What if a good friend of mine is a CPA and he has tax season, and I hate tax season for him because I'm his friend. I hate that he has to just buckle down for, it feels like for a long time, and I send him all these little encouraging texts. I'm like, come on, man, you can do it. By the end, I'm like, I hate this. Like, get out of there, you know? And so, like, Sabbath would force him to stop. It would push against this notion of him being in control. In your groups, I want to ask you this question. What would be the most challenging part of letting go of control of your life for a 24-hour period every week? How would that be hard for you? Oh, I saw Beth's face. Sorry. In your groups, go back to your groups, what would be challenging for you about letting go of control for 24 hours? Ready, go. All right, let's take one more minute, and I know it's not enough. I overheard Pastor Amy up here saying that she would struggle with feeling lazy. Does anybody else feel that? Okay, pretty consistent theme. That if you took a real day off and a real day of unplugging, of rest, and with no work, and it's not in service of any other end, would you feel lazy? What else? 1 or 2 more? How else would this be a challenge? Or how would this... You would feel unproductive, right? Oh, we are so conditioned to think that our life is all about being productive. She said, it is though, thankfully, and then she laughed. It's really hard for me. Like, I read books about like productivity and like that getting things done book. Like those things are like candy for me, right? And it's really, I got to push back against that narrative that my worth is going to come from how much I get done. I saw a hand, yes. Why are you going to set us up like that? I'm going to pretend I didn't hear a single word he said. Okay, good. A bunch of people didn't hear you. We're going to move on. No, I'm just kidding. He said it might be a generality, but he said that, well, you tell me if I'm going to get this right, okay? But that as a man, it's easier for him to sort of rest and take that day off because his spouse is doing all the other stuff for him. He's on his own, man. You're out there by yourself, bro. I got nothing to do with that.
I have the same thing.
Yeah, okay, we got some confessions in the front row here. Yeah. Right. 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 So we're talking about having lists of things to do and feeling the need to complete those lists, right? That makes perfect sense. It's a challenge. How about one more? How about, I want to go to this side of the room. Anybody? Resisting change? I saw my wife's hand up. I don't know if I should ask her or not. So she said, man, you're so cute. She said, I feel we could potentially disappoint our kids by making them miss out on things. That's really hard, right? Yeah.
Justin,
Yeah.
I add this idea of like productivity, right, and connected with what Bethany said of this idea that I'm going to let someone else down if I'm not constantly producing
Right.
or doing, right, and this sense of it's not necessarily about your ego or about being productive. I mean, that could be a sort of separate issue, but also this feeling that if I stop, then I'm going to let other people down.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's like really, really hard for a lot of people.
Yeah, we don't want to let other people down. If I'm in the middle of something and I don't get it done because I took a Sabbath, what does that mean for the other person? All right, last one, and then we're going to move on to the next one. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, it's good. You know, I teach a class on Christian spirituality, and the final exam for that class is to write a rule of life. Okay, so like a plan for, in other words, what are the bumpers that I'm going to put in place to keep me centered, right? To keep me in the place that I want to be. And having a Sabbath practice is absolutely one of the most dominant ones of those. So let's keep moving because the clock is ticking, right? We are beholden to the clock, even though the Sabbath would tell us we're not. Wait a minute. Okay, so one of the other lies is that we are created to consume. Okay, you're created to buy. And you know, there's this huge, monstrous behemoth of an animal swimming through your pocket and mine, reminding me all the time that if I had this thing, my life would be so much better, right? If I had these clothes or shoes in that car, or if my kids had blah, 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 whatever it might, you fill in the blank, right? But man, it really would be fundamentally better if that were true. And that is a lie. The Sabbath, one aspect of the Sabbath is to unplug even from consuming, right? So one way that people practice Sabbath is to say, I'm not going to spend $1. Isn't it ironic? I grew up in Orlando going to Red Lobster with my grandmother and my family often after church, right? And it wasn't until years later I began to realize, well, that's a funny thing to do because I'm creating the necessity for them to work, right? And we still do this often sort of non-reflectively, but it means that I'm participating in this dominant narrative that says I am valuable because of my purchasing power, right? And so what does it look like for us to get off the hedonic treadmill, always pursuing the next source of pleasure and meaning, next source of pleasure and meaning, next source of pleasure and meaning. And as soon as I get this card, that's fine, but who cares anymore because the next one will be better, right? The next trip will really make it so that my life feels full, right? Oh, it's the American dream. Yeah, you guys are so much better at this. All right, you got your own problems though, I know that. There you go, okay. So she was just commenting that in Italy, like we wouldn't have that sort of obsessiveness about us. There's some other, there's some nuancing there. But yeah, I think that this is largely sort of driven into us and baked into our understanding of who we are as a country, as a culture, things like this. What would it be like for you to unplug from the economic system that has shaped our culture, to not spend $1 on the Sabbath and not consume? Go to your groups. Go to your groups and answer this question. What would it be like for you to unplug from the economic system that has shaped our culture? All right, my friends, let's come back together. We're going to keep moving, so can I get just 2 people to share what they shared in their group, maybe? Would it be hard for you to unplug, to not spend, to not consume? Might be. I buy a lot of stuff from my phone. She said, is being on your phone consuming? Yeah. If it's hard for you to let go of it, maybe we should. I don't know. I think that's the critique. So, okay, let me back up. So she said, does it mean that we're not valuable if we're not creating, if we're not purchasing? Is that fair? Making money, right? So are we not valuable if we're not doing those things, right? And that's what I'm saying is that's the poison of our culture that would perpetuate that lie. Yeah, unfettered capitalism, yeah. There's some real problems there, right? Things worth considering and critiquing. And so this is where we're saying, instead of that economic anthropology, how do we have a theological one that would encourage us to say, roam freely on the Sabbath and don't spend $1 and you're still beautiful, right? What would that be like? To really unplug and to disconnect in order to reconnect, right? In order to be reminded of our identity. Okay, we'll keep moving here. The last lie of this sort of always getting more, always running so fast and so hard is that we don't have time to connect, right? This sort of, maybe one of the most sinister parts of this sort of economic anthropology and this way of thinking about life is that it actually strips us of the things that we often would value the most. Relationships with the people that we love the most. Do you remember in the essentialism exercise last week, some of the things that you said were your top 3? Right? Do you know that when you take a Sabbath, you know who's going to join you on the Sabbath? Yourself. Everywhere you go, it stinks sometimes. You're right there. It's really hard to get away from yourself, right? And when you're actually practicing Sabbath, in some ways, and I think this is part of what's terrifying for students, even with 20 minutes, it's terrifying to be confronted with themselves. I love it. She goes, oh, Lord. If you were to take a day of solitude with no phone, would that sound terrible? Would that sound so daunting? I love it. There's some people like, yes, it would, right? Some people are like, get me out of here. I want to go, right? This notion of connecting that you don't have time, it applies to, am I able to connect with myself? Am I able to connect with my neighbor? Am I able to connect with God, right? When I connect with God, I connect with myself, I connect with my neighbor, again, it comes back to an identity formation question, right? Or another way of asking this is, if you slow down long enough to be confronted by the things that sort of consume your life, and you realize you're living out of whack, right? You're out of line with the things that you value the most. It's going to be in these slower, quiet moments where you can come face to face with those realities, and then you're confronted with it. And what you do with that is up to you. We are really good at running and hiding. One of my students said, I feel like my busy lifestyle just helps me avoid having to deal with reality. And I thought, good Lord, if many of us could have said that at the age of 19 or 20, that would have been an amazing gift. How often do we hide from ourselves, from our neighbors, from our relationships, from God, and just smother it in busyness? The Sabbath invites us to a different way, okay? What would it be like for you to create space each week to focus on these most important relationships, these important connections, God, self, neighbor, which would include family, close friends, things like that. Take a minute. What would it be like for you to create space to focus on these connections? Go, in your groups. One more minute. Okay, my friends, we are running out of time. That's ironic. There is an idea, a sociological sort of principle referred to as time affluence versus time famished. Right? Famished. Time affluence, I have time. I have margin, and it's not planned yet. Right? Versus time famished. There is no time for even the things that I'm already committed to, right? And in fact, the effect of being time famished is similar to losing a job, living with severe anxiety and stress. Like there's a number of different things that, like the effects of this, even if you just perceive that you don't have time, whether that's actually true or not, the perception of not having enough time for the things that you want to do can act upon us in this hyper negative way, right? Versus feeling like, oh, I've got some margin. I know that there's like some flexibility here, and if I'm late, you know, or if I want to go do an extra thing, then I have the time for that. This idea of relationships, though, that what's so tragic to me or sad about this is that I hate the idea. I don't want my kids to ever say to me, you are too busy, you know, even though I think I said last week, we got back from vacation, and my son, like the very first day I went to work, he's like, ugh, all you ever do is work, you know. But I can like process that differently, you know. I just don't want my kids to feel like they were like on the side as I lived my life, you know. And so for us, I wonder what it looks like for us to try and sort of do a little bit of an audit and say, do we have any margin in our lives? Do we have any time that is protected and set aside? Or am I always a slave to my calendar in this way? During the workday, I'll be honest, I feel like a slave to my calendar during the workday. It's plotted, it's mapped, but I also have a hard stop that I fight to try and protect, right? Like this is an exception to the norm, to be doing something on a Wednesday night. Normally I'm at soccer practice with my son. So for us, I don't know if you identified with one of these three sort of lies more than the other, you know, that we are in control, or that we're created to consume, or that we don't have time to connect. But might I suggest that Sabbath be a practice that exists to help you sort of carve out the sanctuary and time, right? To resist these lies that have sort of overcome us, as if that's just the norm, right? I think to your point earlier, like as the culture shifts, like we have got to be people who stop and say, hey, I'm going to protect some time here. And you know what? It means I might not keep up with everybody else. And somehow there's a goodness to that that would be better. It's a choice. It's a discipline. It's a practice for us. So your homework is to wrestle with this, and I challenge you to try it on. Pick an hour, half an hour, 3 hours a day. I don't know. Whatever works for you right now to take a baby step in the direction of practicing Sabbath. In fact, we have our students do what's called a purpose project at the end of each unit, at each tradition. And the purpose project for this section is to take a full day off without their phone, without work, no homework, which they're okay with, to push back and to unplug. And so if we assign that to some 19 and 20-year-olds, I think we can assign it to you. So I invite you to consider Sabbath as an invitation back to identity, okay? All right, let me pray for us, and then we will call it a day. Lord, thank you for this gift of a sanctuary and time designed to remind us who we are, whose we are, who you are, and what this life could actually be about. I just ask that you help us all grow in our understanding as we seek to be honest with ourselves about this practice and this idea. Amen. We will be back next week. We will be back next week for Dr. Capes to lead us on a discussion of Aristotle and the sort of practice or the notion of friendship. Have a great night. Thanks for coming out in the rain.